welcome to the Neighborhood Strategy Leaders Community of Practice meeting with our special guest, Jerry Firth. Jerry is the Neighborhood Support Coordinator for the City of Lethbridge. In this role, he coordinates the Beyond Your Front Door Neighborhood Initiative, which encourages citizen engagement to create welcoming and inclusive neighborhoods in Lethbridge. He also works with local neighborhood groups interested in building stronger and more inclusive neighborhoods. Jerry also sits on various committees and project groups, including the Coalition of Municipalities Against Racism and Discrimination, Cheers for Lethbridge, Little Lethbridge Libraries, and the Neighbor Day Planning Committee. Jerry recently completed his Master's in Social Work degree with a specialization in leadership and human services. He's a proud husband and father of 2 young daughters. Active in his community, Jerry attends many events and sitting on different boards and groups, including his own neighborhood association, and as the vice president of the Rotary Club in Lethbridge Mosaic. We're so happy to welcome you to the call today, Jerry, and I will pass it over to you to tell us more about what's happening in Lethbridge, Alberta.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity. Sort of the more I have a chance to engage with other communities, the more I sort of see some of the stuff we're doing is on par, but some of it's also unique. So I'm hoping that you know, we might be able to relate to some of this stuff, but also be able to have some new learnings from maybe some of the things we're doing here in Lethbridge. I also wanted to make a caveat that we don't have a formal neighborhood strategy as of yet. We sort of started out through a demonstration process, sort of like a pilot project, and to sort of see how Lethbridge would engage in this sort of a process of neighborhood development. I have good news, and you'll see it towards the end of the slide, that Lethbridge has picked it up very well, and we're on our way now towards a formal neighborhood strategy, among other things. But like I said, we can get to that as we move forward. So I'm going to introduce you to Beyond Your Front Door, and that's going to be sort of the foundation of what I'm talking about here. I just want to give you a very brief caveat before we get into some of the history and stuff, but this is what makes our situation a little bit different and unique, is that we do a lot of our work out of our community and social development department, and so our focus on neighborhoods is very specific to the social dynamics and social infrastructure of neighborhoods. And then we found that we need to layer everything else on top of that, rather than starting from some other platforms that some municipalities work from, which is more of a sort of a physical development focus. Certainly not all communities, but I recognize that some have been on that path. Also looking at trying to make it a grassroots movement as best we can, so it's for the city to be more of a supportive role in that development. And so Beyond Your Front Door was the name we gave it, because we you'll soon learn a little bit more that we found from research that we're trying to address a lot of social issues in our community, and a lot of that stems from social isolation and the negative impacts that can have. But of course, we wanted to spin that. We wanted to spin it towards an asset-based focus. We just wanted to acknowledge at least the issues that surrounded a lot of the community work that we do. Then when we looked at a lot of these issues, our department does a really good job at focusing on specific targets, but we had an opportunity to sort of take all those same efforts and sort of congeal them at one, sort of in one effort, and that we thought would be from the neighborhood level, sort of looking at these macro concepts and how do we take these macro concepts of social issues and where can we focus our efforts to ensure that we can make a deeper impact. We thought the neighborhoods were a great platform to do that in, and that's where we got this concept of Beyond Your Front Door. And of course, our little tagline there is discovering community in our neighborhoods, because the idea is to encourage people to step outside of these boxes that we've created in our society and out into that community where people gather as a way to connect with each other and to build on opportunities to build stronger, more caring, healthy, welcoming, and inclusive neighborhoods. So to step forward, just a very brief history. In 2008, there was a social policy framework that was developed by our department through community and social development. It was called Towards a Brighter Future, and this led towards an actual social policy implemented for our municipality. Then in 2010, I should say that policy, of course, informed many other initiatives, such as Housing First. In Alberta, we have the Family and Community Support Services, FCSS, so a lot of that work. Later down the road, we had some inclusion work jump in there. So we had a lot of stuff step in. But then in 2010, CSD went to City Council again and got approval for one-time funding for a couple social policy initiatives. One being including building welcoming and inclusive communities, which was something that already had some prior funding, but they just gave a little bit more funds. And then the other was building friendly neighborhoods. Now, these two components specifically allowed us to create a platform to work from, the work that I'm currently doing. These are part of the social policy initiatives that we're doing here in Lethbridge. So from those two specific social policy initiatives, I was doing my practicum here at the City of Lethbridge under my social work degree. And in my senior practicum, there was an opportunity for me to use those funds that were allocated because they hadn't yet been they received the funds but haven't been allocated specifically to a project. So they allowed me to sort of play around with that. And so again, that's the idea of Beyond Your Front Door, where that came from. So it is, the concept is research-based, like I said earlier, based on the idea of this increased social isolation that we're experiencing in our communities and all the negative effects that come from that. But then again, like I said, spinning it towards an asset-based approach. So looking at how do we increase social engagement and inclusion and sort of build some of those positive effects that can come from that. The focus specifically for Beyond Your Front Door is citizen engagement toward building welcoming and inclusive neighborhoods. So you can see how it aligns also not just with building friendly neighborhoods, but also the other social policy initiative of building welcoming and inclusive community. So we've overlapped those two initiatives in my focus. Beyond Your Front Door started as a pilot or a demonstration project primarily within my practicum. It was seen as such a success from the municipality that they decided to put a little bit more money towards it, and they funded me as a temporary position to continue my work. We saw little successes, sort of micro successes as we grew, and you'll learn more about that as I proceed through the slides here. But it eventually led to where it's now seen as an asset in our community. And just recently, within the last 2 weeks, they have made my position permanent with the City of Lethbridge. So I'm now the permanent neighborhood development coordinator for the City of Lethbridge, and I'm able to do more long-term work at this point. And that's really good news for Lethbridge. We're really excited about it, and we want to start to take a lot of our learnings over these last 2.5 years and formalize them into a stronger strategy. So key players, we've had many folks come on the trip along the way. We sort of started with the foundation, which was myself, and then we moved to neighborhood associations, and then neighborhood boosters, and then we sort of grew from there and added more people to the table as we went. So this is a bit of a running list of the folks who we've had or currently have at the table at this point. You can see our overarching committee. This is sort of like, if you will, for the nonprofit sector, there's a board of directors. The CSD committee very much functions like that for our department. They drive a lot of our social policy initiatives. It's sort of like that overarching macro level, the policy drivers of the work that we do. But underneath that banner, there's also a lot of other collaboratives underneath that I align my work with, such as Vibrant Lethbridge, which is our poverty reduction, CMARD, which is our inclusion and equity work, our youth advisory committee, and developmental assets framework, which is focused on the healthy development of children and youth in our community. Those are just a handful. There's other areas that we align ourselves with, but those are sort of 4 primary areas. Of course, then you see myself, but we're also been doing a lot of work, and increasingly so, focused on doing cross-departmental work within our city, recognizing that true community development is not siloed work, and that we need to reach out across the department, specifically those that are impacted by the work that we're focused on. Of course, then, a very strong recognition, prominent recognition that community development happens only when the community is engaged in participating. So you'll see later on that we have a specific model that focuses on this, that we don't have the City of Lethbridge as the leader, the primary leader and the sole driver. Otherwise, we don't believe that the work will be successful. So along the ways, we certainly do include neighborhood associations, or as some communities call them, either community associations or, in Edmonton's case, community leagues. But essentially, that's the same platform. We also have neighborhood boosters. These are folks who don't have a formal organization, but still are very focused on neighborhood development, and so we include them in our work. And then Council of Lethbridge Neighborhoods is sort of an umbrella group that supports the development of neighborhood associations, and that's something that's fairly recent, that developed actually underneath this demonstration project. Then, of course, we look at cross-sectoral and leverage support. So we have been working with various community organizations, very specifically United Way, business sectors such as developers here, local developers, and various funders. Then, of course, I must recognize our intermunicipal support. Certainly Tamarack, through this Neighborhood Strategy Leaders Community of Practice, has been a great asset. I've connected with a lot of fantastic people from across Canada, really looked at a lot of people's work, their existing strategies and initiatives, and so it's been very helpful to help us navigate as we went through our demonstration, but of course to move forward into something more formal. So I briefly touched on leadership, carrying on from those key players. There's some very clear leaders in here. You'll see the bold the bold words. The three key areas or players in this, of course, is myself as the neighborhood development coordinator, the Council of Lethbridge Neighborhoods as a supporting organization for, of course, the neighborhood associations. Those are sort of the three primary leadership areas, and everything else really supports that. But of course, we value any leadership capacity we can get from any of the other avenues from those, from the previous slide here, the key players. But again, just touching base there, it'll make more sense as we move through some of these slides. But another really important discussion I want to briefly have is the leadership model that we use, specifically the leadership model I use, and that's known as situational leadership. This is something that has been developed and is strongly implemented in many organizational management models. So actually through my work, I also recently did my master's degree in social work, specifically focused on leadership and human services. So I had an opportunity to sort of adapt this organizational management model to a community development model. And it's pretty much works as you see on the slide here with the grid, that there's various areas of leadership that's required depending on what the needs are and the capacity of the groups you're working with. So at the very bottom, you'll see the bottom bullet there. It says leadership process. This is how I've adapted it to community development, where sort of at the beginning of all this, it was really myself. I was the head of neighborhood development in Lethbridge. Nothing really existed up until that point. So I started very much from the front and very directive and sort of pulling people together and directing them outwards. But then once we started to see more generation of capacity, that's when we moved to provide more community ownership and to lead towards from the side at that point and become more of a coach and a support. That's really sort of where I sit now. In my role, is that I'm more of that supportive role, and then my hope is as various groups come and go, that I can move myself more towards the back and become more of a cheerleader and provide that empowerment and entrusting them with the work, and hopefully they have the tools and resources by that time to become their own coach and their own support. But I will always be present. But this whole model that we often hear in the work that I do in community development and in the nonprofit sector, recognizing I'm myself not in that world, but still taking the philosophy that you kind of work yourself out of a job. So if we can get our community to the point where they don't need the support, that they can do it on their own, then we're successful at the end of the day. And that is the hopes, but of course recognizing that there's a lot of work to get there, so there's a lot of value with the position that I currently hold. The goals, you'll notice 2 slides here. There's a transition. We had some initial goals set out when we did our demonstration. As we sort of developed through that demonstration and leading towards something more formal, these are the 5 goals that we're leaning towards at this point. Again, they're not formal. These are sort of things that we've developed as we've went along. But the primary goal is to promote engaged, welcoming, and inclusive neighborhoods, to provide support to neighborhood groups in their development, to support neighborhoods in being resilient and relevant. And I presented on that point at the past TAMRAC conference in Edmonton, and I can speak more to that for those folks who weren't there. I also have a slide I can offer you to understand what that means a little bit more. Also to support the development of localized and meaningful neighborhood spaces, and specifically that's talking about what it looks like to have community centers or outdoor spaces that are specific to neighborhoods, not just to the greater population of a municipality. Also, because of our diversity, inclusion, and equity work, we want to see a reduced effects of NIMBYism in our neighborhoods while increasing, of course, those opportunities for social inclusion. Now, NIMBYism, for those who aren't aware of that terminology, like you see in the brackets there, it stands for not in my backyard. And that's that idea of people saying there are certain elements they do not, or certain groups they do not want in their backyard in a discriminatory way. So part of our efforts is to look at how do we address those issues. Now, the importance of this, just to touch on it again very briefly, I direct you to the right side of the slide there. And this is a quote, and you'll see why we got our naming Beyond Your Front Door, because this is a quote that we like to use, that the quality of our lives is affected by the conditions that exist in the area, captured by the view from our front door. And there's a lot of truth to that, and a lot of research supports that we do not, as beings, connected beings, we do not function in isolation, that as individuals and as communities, we are very much impacted by many environmental effects outside of those blocks that we live in. And so with that recognition, we need to sort of work within that. And so on the left side, we have a lot of the strengths that come from doing neighborhood development work. And this was something that came from the FCSS Neighborhood Development Overview, that there's 5 really broad goals based on research that support the work that we're doing in strengthening that stronger sense of community in our communities and our neighborhoods. So we've done many things along the way to sort of gauge the process. Like I said, it's paramount to get that community engagement. So resident engagement was very important to us, and we have that philosophy that we really look at those F words and careful with what F words we use, specifically fun, friendly, and food. Food is really important, we've learned. If you really want to get someone to a space, have food. Any time you have the opportunity, have food. People like to come and eat. And when they come to eat, you can hook them for many of the other things. But of course, the other things that they get excited about is fun and friendly. I know Jim Deers is a fan of parties before meetings. It's a philosophy that we also embrace here in Lethbridge. So we've now are on our 2nd year. We just, this past Saturday, hosted our 2nd annual Neighbor Day, which is really a day to celebrate communities through various parties or projects. And you'll see some pictures that illustrate what those might look like. We have created a block party planning guide to help these groups to plan their own block parties and to celebrate. We've also provided a seed funding for people to host block parties, and this year alone we've seen an increase from 5 block parties hosted in Lethbridge 2 years ago to now I think we're at well over 25 to 30 in Lethbridge hosted just this year alone. Also, we engage people through those efforts of bumping spaces or neighborhood spaces. You'll see in the on the one slide there we have a community garden. We do a project under the Little Lethbridge Libraries, which is a concept based from the Little Free Libraries. We're very big into social media. We actually have a very strong following in both Facebook and Twitter, and actually have a broad stretch of engagement through there. We also use traditional media and, of course, a local magazine. And you'll see in the bottom image there's two pictures there of our local magazine called Lethbridge Living. And they've done two feature articles on the work that we're doing. The first one, you'll see a picture of myself and my colleague standing all suave by a door there. And then the second one is the component of when we started to get the puzzle pieces together in building our neighborhoods. They've done 3 other articles specific to some of the work that we're doing. So they've been a huge champion for us, and we're very happy that we've been able to win them over as an ally. We're very big on invitation. When we look at social isolation, a lot of reasons people don't access spaces in our neighborhoods anymore is because they feel like they're not welcomed. So we take a direct effort to go out to them, whether it be to their houses directly or to the spaces they currently attend, and invite them to these other spaces. And you'll notice in one of the pictures there too, it was a process we called the invitation walkabout, where we went around to people's front doors and sort of introduced them to this concept of neighborhood development, and it's very well received. Of course, community connections or community circles or dialogues, that's something pretty typical. And of course, we like to piggyback on the neighborhood meetings and make sure we're present there. Now, so I'm being cognizant of time here. We're still doing good. So I want to touch now on the framework that I talked about earlier, how we like to function in our city, that we don't want the municipality, the city of Lethbridge, to be the driver of this. And so it's what we call the ternary model. Before I get to that, I just you'll notice on the slide here that I did touch on some of the other frameworks we worked from. I already talked about the social policy and that we're research-based. I also want to acknowledge that we are asset-based, and we do a lot of ABCD work. That's from John McKnight, and so that's the asset-based community development. We use a lot of their work, plus some other models that are asset-based that overlap into our efforts. Now back to the ternary model here. This is just sort of a temporary name that we've given it. We haven't really formally named it yet, but this image really explains it well, that we see it as a partnership and a collaborative more than a hierarchy, and I think that's really important. And you'll notice that there's a triangle, but the triangle has rounded edges, and that's sort of to illustrate John McKnight's imagery of the triangle of organizations and the circle for community work. We sort of wanted to capture the idea of bringing community development through the work that I do, which really is through a bureaucracy. So what does it look like from the city side doing community development work in a bureaucracy, which sort of have two different functions sometimes? And so we're trying to work through this model of how do we overlap those so that we can go at the speed of community alongside bureaucracy, which sometimes they don't travel at the same speed. So how do we align those? And in this model, of course, you see ourselves, specifically my work as Neighborhood Development Coordinator, but of course under the auspice of our social policy initiatives, as we work with neighborhood associations and of course then the Council of Lethbridge Neighborhoods. And you'll notice the Council of Lethbridge Neighborhoods as well is not in a hierarchy to neighborhood associations. They are not a driver, and they do not dictate what neighborhood associations can or cannot do. They themselves are also there solely as a support. So you'll notice how that partnership and collaborative sort of works within that dynamic. And I can certainly answer more questions about that. I'm sure there are plenty there at this time, or we can wait towards the end and I can answer them at that point. Okay, we'll move forward. So we've had a lot of key learnings through this demonstration. Like I said, the community development occurs often faster than the speed of bureaucracy. So trying to work through that red tape and make it easier for our neighborhoods to provide those opportunities for their community through our support at the city. And we've been fortunate in Lethbridge to have that sort of support. We still have some gaps, we recognize, but in consultation with other municipalities, it sounds like some cities and municipalities work through some very significant issues and challenges. So I'm happy to see that we've been able to be successful at our end, and I'm curious to see how we can create a model that might work well for other municipalities. Of course, there's a strong recognition of how the social infrastructure really adds depth to the neighborhood development, and that we really use that model of social infrastructure which informs the physical infrastructure and vice versa. So it's not one without the other, and how do those two overlap well? We have a significant interest. We've been seeing a very significant interest with individuals in the neighborhoods wanting to create that stronger sense of community and belonging in their communities. And Lethbridge is at a point now we're nearing 100,000 folks, and we are moving beyond that small town mentality. So we're finding that people really want to now focus in on their neighborhoods where they really can create that sense of community again, like small towns have, rather than this large entity that's really hard to grasp. What does Lethbridge mean? It's hard for people to grasp that, let alone, what does it mean to be an Albertan? What does it mean to be a Canadian? So they're trying to find a way to really harness that sense of identity at the neighborhood level. But of course, in this process, we're still recognizing that there's a very significant population of isolated individuals, and that has a significant impact on neighborhoods and communities. So how do we address that? And again, like I said, we've learned that neighborhoods certainly are the platform to address a lot of those social issues. And of course, that process of resiliency and relevancy then plays in. So successes, a lot. We're very happy to see this huge, well, I guess not just interest, but this huge hold on neighborhood development in Lethbridge, and it's allowed us to reach successes that we never even initially targeted. Within this demonstration, it was to be very simple, and then all of a sudden we found that we needed to reach bigger and broader, and that's why, of course, we now are stepping towards something more formal. But you'll see that we've created a lot of partnerships. We've developed the Council of Lethbridge Neighborhoods. We have increased city support, including cross-departmental support. We now have neighborhood-specific spaces that we're developing and building because of a lot of that city support and cross-departmental work. And those things are such as community gardens and neighborhood bulletin boards and the Little Lethbridge libraries. We have a very significant increase in our engagement through social media. Again, that strong support for local media. And those are just some of the highlights of where we've been able to come. I wanted to create this map for you because it shows you just a bit of an illustration of the success that we've had. One way that we look at our success is through understanding the development of neighborhood associations, because we use neighborhood associations in our social development. It's not purely physical or land development with the neighborhoods. So you'll see that 2 years ago, before BYFD, we had only 2 existing neighborhood associations and 2 other neighborhoods that were sort of engaged. Now, 2 years later, we have not all the neighborhoods are lit up now. We had a few come online actually this past Neighborhood Day. So we now have 23 neighborhoods out of 43 that we had in Lethbridge from the initial 5. And we now have 7 associations, 7 more that by the end of this year will be incorporated. And so just a brief illustration of how much progress we've made within those last 2 years. But certainly, with even with all of this success, there are many challenges existing, and of course, short-term and long-term. The most significant is still to be able to create opportunities for welcoming, inclusive neighborhoods. Social issues are not a short-term process. This is something that when we do our neighborhood strategy, that it's going to be starting with a 10-year plan, and of course to do a review every 5 years within that, and then do another review at the end to see how we can extend our efforts. This neighborhood strategy will also align with a lot of the other work that we're doing with other departments, but specifically towards our goal of welcoming inclusive neighborhoods. Another challenge is engaging citizens in community life. We've found that it's very difficult to get people engaged in community, let alone those who are socially isolated and disconnected. A lot of the folks who are socially isolated are so for a very reason. And so to meet them where they're at is a significant challenge that we're still working through what that means. It's very easy to get the people who are already engaged, it's very easy to get them tied in because that's where their mindset is, that's where their sort of living philosophy is. But if we want to really address a lot of our goals, we really need to try to find a way to reach out to the people who aren't already engaged. Finding grassroots leadership. Again, like I said, because we don't want this to be a city-driven initiative, part of my role is to help support the development of this grassroots leadership at the neighborhood level. And that's been a very difficult process because a lot of people are willing to step up and do one-time, one-off, and sort of often even just sit in the background. It's very difficult to find someone willing to be sort of at that front end and really driving a lot of the effort. We do have a few, and we rely on them, but we're careful not to rely on them too much so that we don't burn them out and then be back at zero. Support for multiple neighborhoods. Right now, like I said, it's just me, Neighborhood Development Coordinator numero uno, trying to support 43 neighborhoods. So to build capacity, that grassroots is very important. Back to fitting in that community development model within a bureaucratic model, we're still working through that, but we're finding some successes, but it still remains a challenge. And then we also are at risk. We might have the city support now, but next municipal election, depending on what council is and what their strategic objectives are, could shift some of that support. So, you know, we want to keep that on the radar. That's why creating a neighborhood strategy is important, a formal neighborhood strategy, because then that buy-in can become more long-term. Then, of course, limited resources. In our municipality, I'm sure other municipalities might see the same thing, that social efforts aren't always the most well-funded and supported. We certainly feel that here. We've had some significant support through this last council, and we hope it continues, but it is something that still restricts some of the work that we do. And what's next? I've said it a few times. We want to develop that formal neighborhood strategy. We want to continue our development of neighborhood spaces, continued support for those neighborhood groups. That's ongoing. And then, of course, something I haven't yet mentioned, but we want to establish a neighborhood recognition program. That's something that we want to align with our Neighbor Day, and it's a way for us to continue to try to build that grassroots momentum and leadership by giving people sort of more reason and also to inspire people to be involved within the neighborhood development. And that will be the end of my slide. So thank you very much, and I'm open to questions or conversation.
Wow, Jerry, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today. I am sure that there are lots of questions. Howard says he did enjoy it. Thank you. David, I have a question here from David. David, if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask there.
Hello, I'm unmuted now. Yeah, my question is, and it was about your challenges, and in particular, maybe if you could expand on that political risk and the changing mindsets within council, and how are you approaching and how are you moving that forward to ensure that this program and this community development keeps moving forward in, you know, the next council?
Yeah, really good question. Fortunately, we have our Community and Social Development Committee, and that committee is made up of, we have actually 3 city councilors that sit on that committee. Like I said, that's our policy level in the work that we do in our department. So we have those city members, city council members. We have various community organizations and community members at large that sit on that group, and they're actually a pretty powerful group. They city council has been pretty receptive to a lot of the feedback that they provide. So we certainly rely on them in promoting the work that we do in our department. Like I had said, that formal neighborhood strategy is going to be vital in the long term. A lot of our other initiatives in our department, such as the Inclusion and Equity and the Housing First initiative, all have a document that guides their work, whether it be a 10 or 20-year plan. And because of that, they have something to fall back on. But I think it's also important that when we do that neighborhood strategy, that we have the existing existing city council on board and align it with their existing strategy. And then also to do that cross-departmental work, because then we have a buy-in from the larger part of the municipality. Rather than this being solely a community and social development initiative, it truly becomes a City of Lethbridge initiative. But then to overlap that, to have a huge voice with the community engagement, because we're also finding that city council, of course, are representatives of the citizens. So if this neighborhood strategy has a lot of the citizen voice in it, they're more apt to sort of continue that commitment. So it's not just an administrative document, it becomes a community document as well. And so that's sort of our goal. So that ternary model, we want to overlap in all of our efforts, that it really shines through that this is truly a community development effort, both from the city and from the community itself. And we're hoping that's going to lend well to that longevity of sustainability with city support.
Thanks for that answer and insights there. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah.
Jerry,
I'm not.
Go ahead, David.
Oh no! If you have other questions, I was going to build on something for the whole group. To ask the whole group a little bit.
Okay, great. I do have a question from Shira Stanfield from Surrey. Do you have an outline of what will be in your neighborhood strategy? Have you found another city that has a good one?
Yeah, we haven't looked too much into it yet. We do have multiple neighborhood strategies that are in our queue. And we're actually going to be kicking up a committee that will be doing a lot of this work within the next month or two. So I myself haven't sat back on it too much to really look at it in detail. But what I am aware of from my brief review of these strategies is who was the one that presented last month?
Victoria, the city of Victoria,
yes.
With Kimberly.
Yes. They had a model that we were very keen on, but we also recognized that there were some additives that we wanted to include because, like I said, the way we're approaching our work is a little bit different in some ways because it's coming from a community and social development model. But I would say standing out, Victoria one is one that we're sort of aligning ourselves with at this point.
Wonderful. We also have a comment here from Karen Oldham of London. Fantastic presentation. Thanks for sharing. She said that the two of you would have a great conversation because they just finished their 5-year neighborhood strategy and now embarking on the next 3 to 4 year strategy. And they want to focus on the neighborhood association development work. So I'm going to connect the two of you offline, Jerry, if that's okay for the two of you to connect.
That would be great.
Yeah. Are there any other questions that are percolating for people? If not, David, if you had a question you wanted to throw to the group, I would love to hear that.
Yeah, my group, and building on what Jerry had indicated about that political aspect, and this is the question is, what are people seeing? Like, we talk about neighborhood strategies and this community development and getting the grassroots leaders doing it, but are those people who are leading this thing being political and bringing these ideas to the politicians and helping guide strategies, or are we in, like, as we come towards elections or something, that people are more concerned that their street is being plowed, or they're getting a new road, or other more physical infrastructure, those things? Does community actually issues influence the political structure or the political forces in cities? Just
Yeah.
throwing that out.
If I can jump in quickly, because that is exactly one of our efforts, is to support that social infrastructure, which then can feed into those discussions, because a typical municipal model is brick and mortar, right? The physical infrastructure has been a strong focus, and we're recognizing that it's important to bring that social infrastructure into the conversation. Since we've been starting to do that, we in Lethbridge, we have recognized that it's happening. Just recently, there was a neighborhood that was very concerned with what was happening in their community, and it went political, and it went to council. This was an issue that was never addressed before. It came up to council many a times, but they started to see, so this neighborhood stepped up, and then other neighborhoods jumped on board with them as well. And because of that pressure of all these citizens now standing up for that same issue, and it was a social issue, that they got council support at that point. And so I think, like my conversation there about that situational leadership, about giving capacity and then empowerment, what we're finding is that really what is at a lack is that in the previous model, the city always did for citizens. And we're trying to shift that to say that the citizens can also do for themselves and for their city. And that's through the building of that social infrastructure. So it's about empowering and encouraging people to share with them that they have that voice, and that, and it doesn't always have to go political either. That it certainly does help.
Anybody else had comments? Thanks, Jerry, for that.
Well, just one question. Jerry, am I with you there?
Yep, you are.
Howard in Edmonton. Yeah, so in your imagination of the future, what would you say a built neighborhood would look like? We've looked at, you've mentioned just now the ability of a neighborhood to organize and advocate on its behalf. Do you have any other ideas in terms, imaginations around what we talk about neighborhood development? What's a developed neighborhood look like?
Yeah. So, I mean, we have a lot of visions and imaginations. The grandest scale is that people who aren't typically seen or heard in the neighborhoods are starting to become seen and heard, and meaning that they're being welcomed back in those spaces. And when we talk about being welcomed, that means there's a lack of accessibility, and accessibility is not always physical. Sometimes it's physically accessible or cognitively accessible. So our vision is to see people coming out into community and being a part of it. That's part of the reason why we feel like there's also a lack in that community drive behind city council or other initiatives sometimes, is because the voice sometimes is non-existent. I've sat in many city council, and you hear the same voices almost all the time. Same people show up to the community engagements, and what we're trying to do is to get more people engaged and involved, and give them a reason to be engaged and involved. And the reason we feel they're not is because they don't feel like they have a sense of community or a sense of place. So that's a huge focus for us, is to support that process and to see more people engaged in that way.
So that's really an advocacy or a community neighborhood engagement where it's operating at almost at an issues-based level. We need this in our neighborhood, and we want to hear that from each voice. Am I hearing you correctly?
Well, so two things. We're cautious on doing issue-based advocate, or to have issues drive the initiative, because what we're finding within our experience, neighborhoods, when they develop from an issue, they usually fold once that issue has passed. So we want to use that sort of as a platform that definitely brings people to the table, but what we're looking to do is how can we have an everyday social functioning of a community that's encouraging and welcoming for people to be a part of it every day, not just when issues arise. And so we want to support opportunities, and part of that is our work in creating those bumping spaces or those neighborhood spaces, and to meet people where they're at, that sort of existing spaces, and to overlap them. You know, I'll give you a good example for that is if you have a community garden, that brings gardeners. If you have a little library, that brings people who like to read. If you have a bulletin board, that brings people who are curious about what's happening in the community. If you put all three of those in one space, you have three people coming for three different reasons, but now an opportunity for them to connect with someone they may not have connected with prior to that reason. So those are sort of our efforts, is to create a network within our communities and give people a reason to be a part of that network. Not just for issues, but for an everyday sense of community.
Build relationship, just for the sake of neighboring relationship is what I hear.
For the sake of that, because this is certainly based in research that when you are connected in your community, you yourself, not just yourself as an individual, but the community benefits. So it addresses social isolation, it addresses mischievous behavior such as graffiti and vandalism, it addresses mental health, safety. So our thought is if we want to address a lot of those larger issues, we have to give people a reason to feel like they belong to a community, because when they have that feeling, that's when you truly do address the grassroots of those larger issues.
Absolutely. Do you have anything at a block or cul-de-sac level, Jerry, in your thinking?
Yes. Yeah, so that's the block parties. So what we're thinking, we actually like your model, and we're not there yet with most of our neighborhoods. We don't have enough capacity. We do in a few of them, but once we do, we certainly would like to use the Abundant Communities model with those block leaders. But right now, to help us build capacity, one of the things we're doing is block parties. So once we sort of get a few people hooked, then we use them as a driver to expand out. And a really good example of that is one of our neighborhoods. That's exactly what they did. They did a block within a 3-block radius. Within 3 years that we've been working with them, they have now expanded into a formal neighborhood organization that is one of the largest neighborhoods, and they actually have the largest Neighbor Day celebrations. They have the most people committed to their board. They have the strongest support with all their initiatives, and that's because they started from a small model. We strengthened, this is back to that situational leadership, where we strengthened a small core group, directed them, then when they helped build their capacity, then supported them, and now they're at the point where really delegated, it's yours. You're totally empowered. They have everything they need to continue forward without a lot of support from my end. And we're hoping to use that model with all the work that we do in all of our neighborhoods.
Hi, this is April. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. So I was invited on by Howard Lawrence. I think I'm sort of a rogue participant. Jerry, we've talked before. Really exciting stuff. And one of my questions was regarding, the challenge you mentioned with people who are more socially isolated. That being a challenge, what have you seen that's promising, that's been tried?
Two things. Some of these folks are connected in some way, like maybe through a community organization, whether that be through mental health or through an Aboriginal organization or whatever. So we have a motto in social work, and some people might have heard it, but a framework of practice in social work is to go or meet people where they're at. And that means simply instead of asking people to come to you, to go to where they are, whether that be with the organizations they exist in, whether that be to community spaces, that be pubs, swimming pools, right even up to their front door, that's the process that we're looking at, that to get, instead of just inviting people to come out, we need to go to them first to invite them out. We're currently working on a strategy around the invitational walkabout I talked about earlier. When we, so how do we support neighborhoods to themselves go door to door, and what sort of questions should they ask, and what things should they be cautious of, and you know, that sort of process. Because we're finding, even again back to Victoria Park, that there's a lot of success in doing that door-to-door campaigning, and to sort of win back what that means, you know, from what it can mean for some people. But again, back to your question, it's really just going to where they are, meeting people where they're at, and that takes a lot of work, a lot of time. So we're trying to find a strategy that best fits that.
Thank you. I have one more question too. How much have you found it successful or challenging to involve faith-based organizations?
Like I said, it is part of our philosophy to meet people where they're at, and we, in Southern Alberta, we're called the Bible Belt for a reason. We have a lot of people that are faith-based, and we have many different faiths, all the way from Christian to Muslim and Aboriginal, etc. So we are certainly not opposed to approaching these groups, and they've even come towards us. The only challenge that we have with that is we're very cognizant that we do our work from a diversity and inclusion model, and that we have been challenged by some specific faith-based groups in some of the work we do, because they themselves have sort of they've come to us with some NIMBYism, if you will, right? Like there are certain things they don't want to see, and this is not just faith-based. This is a lot of other groups. So that's when we get to have those opportunities then to work with those groups. So we don't see it as a door closed. We see it as an opportunity to continue that work. But the other challenge we have with the faith-based groups is because we want to be more geographic, like neighborhood focused, most of our churches aren't neighborhood focused anymore. That we have people that attend a church that come from multiple neighborhoods. So we're trying to figure out, what does that mean? So we're not, again, we don't want to shut that door, but what does that mean? How can we get our message through this organization, the faith-based organization, and approach multiple neighborhoods at the same time?
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. I'm just conscious of the time, that it's already 2 o'clock, believe it or not. And I actually have a couple questions for you, Jerry, but I want to be respectful of people's time, so maybe we can wrap up the call, and I might follow up with you offline if that's okay.
That's okay with me.
Yeah. So as promised, and as a standard for this call, I did record it, and I will be editing it and sending it out to you all, hopefully within a couple days, along with an email with the slide deck, and also maybe a quick update on the survey I sent out the other day with the results that I have already, and with maybe some gentle reminding to fill it out if you haven't already. And I just want to say we so appreciate all of you who are connecting us with your colleagues who are doing this work, or just getting started out on this work, or curious about this work in other municipalities. So please continue to put people in touch with us so we can welcome them to our call. And I just want to send a very, very big thank you to you, Jerry, for bringing your experience and wisdom with us. This is a model I know a lot of people are paying close attention to these days and learning a lot from. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. And just to add, I was saying to my manager that there's a lot of pressure on us now that we're going to have to get this right, or we might have a lot of people giving us a scowl.
Yes. Well, we're here for you to help you get through that, hopefully.
Yes, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah. So, so I think our next meeting will probably be in September. There's a few people who have let me know that they're interested in presenting. If any of you on the line today are interested in presenting, you can let me know, but I'll follow up in a few days and hopefully begin to think about dates for September when we can meet again. So thank you so much, everyone. I wish you all a wonderful day and a beautiful summer.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.